Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 on the female reproductive system. Today we're going to be going through the actual cycle. So in the last video we looked at the process of oogenesis and follicle formation, and now we're going to kind of tie that in to what's going on in both the ovaries and the uterus. So the female reproductive cycle, it can be taught in a multitude of different ways. One of the things that you always want to keep in mind is that even though we may be talking about the ovary at one point and then the uterus later, everything that we do talk about in either cycle is happening simultaneously. So one of the things that will be really helpful for you to kind of keep track of where everything's going is to make a little chart. One of the things you can do is to, as we will go through, you'll see that we have a bunch of different sort of timelines that are happening. So if you make a chart that's kind of similar like this, where we have one row is for the ovaries, one row is for the uterus, and then you can break it down by what's going on during each of the different phases, then you can kind of see, okay, well during, this phase, this is going on in the ovary, this is what's happening in the uterus. That way everything's kind of on one page instead of treating them as separate entities. Now, I am going to treat them slightly as separate entities because it kind of helps us learn what's going on in each region. Now, the whole goal of the ovarian cycle is just to do all the things that we talked about in the last lecture. Get the oocyte, form the follicle, ovulate, send signals to the corpus luteum, and then if we don't get pregnant, we get a corpus albicans. The uterine cycle's job is going to be to develop that endometrium so that if there is a fertilization, the zygote can actually implant in that uterine wall. And then that's basically where we'll end, and we'll pick up on that journey in chapter 4 when we talk about the development. Now, just a quick reminder, these are the hormones we'll be talking about today. Estrogen and progesterone, remember these are the female sex hormones. Estrogens are going to be secreted by those ovarian follicles. Remember the granulosa cells take the testosterone from the theca interna, turn it into estrogen. And then we have progesterone, which is primarily secreted by the corpus luteum, name here progestation. It's going to help, hopefully, ensure that if there is a fertilization, it can be maintained. This is the hormone that spikes during pregnancy. And then we have LH and FSH. These are the ones that are going to be involved in both the production of gametes as well as things like triggering ovulation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can really talk about the female cycle in a multitude of different ways. And what I've done here is we're going to talk about them in different phases. So instead of specifically just talking about this is what's going on only in the ovaries and then talking about what's going on only in the uterus, we will be talking about what's going on in both of those organs, but during 4 specific phases: the menstrual phase, the pre-ovulatory phase, ovulation, and the post-ovulatory phase. I will be putting days on these ranges here. The average cycle for a woman is 28 days. This is for each individual woman. It differs, and in each woman, her cycle can also differ. So you are not going to have a 28-day cycle every month, not for every woman. Some women have shorter cycles, others are going to have much longer cycles. It really just depends on the woman themselves. And like I said, these cycles can change and waver, a few days from each other, depending on month to month. All right, so let's talk first about the menstrual phase. The menstrual phase is where we actually start the female cycle, which is kind of odd, especially if you're a woman. We tend to see this part of our cycle as sort of like the end, like, okay, cool, well, now we're on our period and we just kind of start over. This is actually the start. So you start your female cycle with what we colloquially know as the period. And what your period is where that innermost lining of the endometrium, the stratum functionalis, it sloughs off, okay? By this point, there has been no fertilization. The layer has broken down because we now lack estrogen and progesterone. So it's going to be really important to understand that one of the major reasons the period starts is a drop in hormones. In fact, this is what, oral contraceptives utilize. You'll take 3 weeks of a progesterone, an estrogen, or some sort of, other combination of hormone pill, and then you don't take them for a week, hormones drop, and you have a period, okay? Now in the ovaries, we are getting ready to create a new follicle. So the primordial follicles are developing, the primary follicles from the last unit continue their development. We kind of just have this overall growth phase happening during the first, 1 to 4, 1 to 5 days of the female cycle. Now, once the menstrual phase is over, we enter the pre-ovulatory phase. Now, within the ovaries, this particular phase is called the follicular phase. The follicular phase is basically that after menses, but before ovulation. So during this period of time, one follicle, typically, right? Sometimes women can ovulate 2 or more. It's very rare, but it can happen. Typically, only one follicle is going to be chosen to continue forward and develop into secondary and a Graafian follicle. This particular follicle will start to continue its growth. All of the others will stop growing. And the signal to do that is through hormones. So once this follicle is chosen through hormones, it will send out signals to the others around it to sort of go into atresia, and it will then lead to only one follicle typically going through maturation and being ovulated. Now this particular follicle, remember, is going to start to secrete estrogen. So during this phase, we're going to see a rise in estrogen levels. And remember, as we get closer to ovulation, one of the things that also happens, so we're getting this estrogen level, but we're also getting a rise in testosterone, because we need the testosterone from those theca interna cells to make estrogen from the granulosa cells. And remember, as I mentioned in my last video, in some women, that rise in testosterone is correlated to a rise in their libido, so that their body's basically telling them, you're about to ovulate, have intercourse, so that we can have a fertilized egg. Now, while all this is happening in the ovaries, the uterus is also going through its own particular phase, which is called the proliferative phase. So remember, to proliferate means to grow in number or size. So what happens here is those estrogens, which once again are from the follicle, they tell the uterine lining, they tell that stratum functionalis to be rebuilt. So this is a period of rebuilding. We just sloughed off an entire thick layer of stratum functionalis. So we need to rebuild it. This is what the embryo is going to implant in. So we want to make sure it's thick enough. And as we progress through this month, we're also going to start adding in a bunch of other structures that are going to be helpful for if there is an implantation. Okay, so during the pre-ovulatory phase, we have the follicular phase of the ovary, where we choose the follicle, it continues its maturation, we get a rise in estrogen. We have the pre-ovulatory phase of the uterus, which is called the proliferative phase, where that endometrial lining, the stratum functionalis, is going to grow. and it's triggered by the release of the estrogens from that follicle. Okay, now that brings us to ovulation. So ovulation is only happening in the ovary. So during day 14, that proliferative phase of the uterus is still going on. So from days about 5 to 14 in the uterus, it's just growing a layer. Okay. In the ovary, however, we start to see action. Now what happens here is the Graafian follicle, which is this really dark structure you see here. This whole thing is the ovary. This is the Graafian follicle. It is going to, as I mentioned in the last video, come to the surface of the ovary and release the egg, which is this little golden structure you see here. Okay, remember, it is surrounded by tons of different cells. We have the corona radiata, we have the zona pellucida around it. So that's why it looks so large. We can actually see it. So this egg is released. That process is called ovulation. Some women can actually feel this. It's called Mittelschmerz. And I totally spelt it wrong. It's a German name, but it's like ovulation pain sometimes some women can feel. It's like a sharp pain because this is literally exploding out of your ovary. This was actually captured accidentally during a routine laparoscopic procedure, so it was obviously published. Now, what is actually triggering the follicle to release the egg? This is one of the very few cases that we have of positive feedback in the human body. Most of the time in the human body, like we saw with the endocrine system, something happens, it causes the release of something or the action of something, and that result turns off the system. So it's like your thermostat. The house gets too cold, the heater turns on, the temperature goes up, that turns your thermostat off. That's how most things work in the human body. With things like ovulation, and as we saw in the endocrine system, labor, that's positive feedback, where now that result actually continues to increase the initial stimulus. So in this case, what's going on is as I increase my estrogen levels, it's going to cause an increase in luteinizing hormone, which causes an increase in more estrogen. So it's this big loop that only stops once the egg is ovulated. Okay, so this is an example of positive feedback through LH, luteinizing hormone, and estrogen. So we see this huge, when we look at the end of the lecture today, you'll see a huge spike. We call that the LH surge, and it's what lets the ovary time its ovulation. Once again, day 14 is the average. It varies from woman to woman. Some ovulate later, others are going to ovulate earlier. So when you're trying to get pregnant, that's why you have a lot of different ways of testing to see if you are pregnant or not. There are strips that you can actually urinate on. They're like little, it's almost like a little cheap pregnancy test, and you would pee on one end, and if you get 2 lines on it, it would show you that you have reached the LH surge. And it's actually something you would do every day about a week before you think you're going to ovulate, and you would see the lines get darker and darker, and that would indicate that you're about to ovulate. It's time to go. You can also check to see if you've ovulated. This is what a lot of women that are doing, they're trying to conceive. There's often a spike in temperature, and it's sustained. So a lot of women that are trying to conceive will also take what's called their basal temperature every day. And so you'll notice that there's a rise and a consistent sort of plateau of your temperature. Your temperature drops, that usually happens just before menses. So you typically would see a temperature curve like this. It's not by many, many degrees. It might be 1 or 2, and it's usually taken to the 10th or 100th of a degree. So these are some ways women practically can tell if they're ovulating, other than just like actually being in surgery accidentally and seeing an ovulation occur. Okay? Now, after ovulation, we enter post-ovulatory phase. Remember, post means after. So this is everything up until the next period, as it were. So in the ovary, we call this the luteal phase, and that's because, remember, after ovulation, the only thing that leaves the ovary is the egg, the zona pellucida and the corona radiata that's kind of surrounding it, some fluid. That's what tends to create the pain as well, is irritation of the peritoneal cavity from the fluid. Well, the other thing that happens is that the follicle, the remaining cells, those are going to be left over. They stay with the ovary. And remember from our previous video that follicle is going to then become this really big, frumpy looking structure called the corpus luteum. Okay, so that's easy to remember. Luteum, luteal phase. And remember, the purpose of the corpus luteum is to communicate to the uterus that an egg has been released, it's on its way, it could be fertilized. And it does this by the release of two hormones. The major hormone that's released is progesterone, and then it does release a little bit of estrogen. But the major hormone here, the major spike we see, is in progesterone. So we see an estrogen spike in the pre-ovulatory phase, and we see a progesterone spike in the post-ovulatory phase, because we're about ready to hopefully gestate. Okay? Now, remember, there's two outcomes to that follicle. The first is the corpus luteum, which we just talked about. This is going to release progesterone and a little bit of estrogen. If it receives word back from the uterus that there has been a fertilization, the corpus luteum is going to hang out until the human chorionic gonadotropin and other structures that are found within the developing fetus and extraembryonic membranes can maintain that pregnancy. So that's why we talked about this in the endocrine chapter. The way we find out if we are in fact pregnant is by taking a urine sample and looking at the amount of HCG in the pregnancy. This does exponentially rise as you become further and further along in the pregnancy. That's why they always advise wait until you've missed your period, because then there should be enough HCG to actually detect it. Some women produce more than others and can detect a pregnancy earlier on than others. Now, if there isn't a pregnancy, which more often than not, there's not going to be a pregnancy, the uterus does not send a signal back to the corpus luteum. So it says, okay, there's been no implantation, and it's going to revert down to that corpus albicans, which remember was the white little scar tissue, basically, that now replaces the very large corpus luteum. The major distinction between the corpus luteum and albicans, besides size and color, is the fact that the corpus albicans secretes no hormones. Without those hormones, progesterone and estrogen, the uterine lining is basically told, all right, we're done, we're going to try this again. And so the whole cycle starts. The ovarian cycle restarts, the uterine cycle restarts, and we begin menstruation. So it's all due to a drop in hormones. So women that take oral contraceptives or have an IUD, which kind of looks like this, it's a little T, oops, it's a T, a little string, so you can know it's still there and be able to remove it. It's about the size of a dime. Women that are on hormonal IUDs, hormonal contraceptives, some women have an implant in their upper arm that releases hormones continuously. They can actually miss periods, okay? Or if you take an oral contraceptive, you can force yourself to miss a period by just continually taking your hormonal pills. Because as long as there's no drop in the hormones, you will not menstruate. Okay, you can still grow a uterine lining because you're producing estrogen, but it's not going to be as thick, and it's going to be maintained until we reduce those hormone levels. So what's going on in the uterus while all this corpus luteum albicans stuff is happening? Well, now we're in the secretory phase. We've doubled our lining. We've basically gone from a layer that looks like this to a layer that looks like this. And now we need to start adding in some extra components, so should there be a fertilization and an implantation, more importantly, the uterus can sustain that embryo. So some of the things that are going to happen is we're going to get spiral arteries, okay, which will supply blood. You're also going to get uterine glands, hence the name secretory, which are going to help provide nourishment, okay? So during this time, we're going to get a signal from the corpus luteum that, hey, keep on doing what you're doing. Make those spiral arteries, make those uterine glands, keep thickening that uterus layer. There could be a zygote on the way. But if there is no implantation, then the uterus does not send that signal, that human chorionic gonadotropin. It does not get sent back to the ovary. So corpus luteum degrades, progesterone and estrogen levels decline. And what happens is these spiral arteries, they're going to constrict and they're going to stave off blood flow to this whole layer. And so because of that, it becomes necrotic and dies. And that's why you get the sloughing off. So you get, in menstrual discharge, you're going to have the mucus, you're going to have the blood, obviously, because we're dealing with vasculature here. And you're also going to have the actual lining here that's going to come off. Okay. You get menstrual cramps from the myometrium as it tries to contract and help force this out. Why some women have heavier or lighter periods or stronger or worse contractions for cramps is very dependent on the woman themselves. It depends on if they have any underlying conditions, such as polycystic ovarian syndrome or endometriosis. There's a lot of differences between women. So not every woman is going to have the same experience during the menstrual cycle or the female cycle as her friend, as her mother, as her sister. It's very, very individual. So what I've just described is a very average, statistically average experience. So those of you ladies that are watching, you may say, hey, my experience is different, and that's totally normal. There's a lot of range in what is considered normal and abnormal. Now, in regards to what we just talked about, we can see here we have our ovarian cycle and our uterine cycle. And one of the things I love most about this particular diagram is that we can, at any point, any day, go and say, I want to see what's going on at day 13. And you can see what phase of the uterus you're in and what's going on with the ovaries at the same time. So this is a really good diagram to have in front of you as you're running through this material again. And what I want to leave you on is this diagram. Remember, we were talking about how there's going to be rises and falls of hormones. So here we can see our big LH spike, which is going to trigger ovulation. Okay, we have that rise in estrogens because of the granulosa cells that are taking the testosterone from the theca interna, turning it into estrogen. We get that positive feedback loop here to help trigger ovulation. As we ovulate, those granulosa cells stop working, right? So we leave the follicle behind. They don't work very much anymore. We get a small rise in estrogen from the corpus luteum, but the major hormone in the second half of our cycle is going to be that progesterone. Okay, so the major hormone is going to be estrogen in the first part, LH during ovulation, and progesterone in the second half. You'll notice FSH kind of just wavers as it goes. One thing I'm going to direct you guys to right now before I end the video is this video here. It goes through everything that we just talked about, so if you'd like to see the process in action, this is a great video to watch. Okay, that's it. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me.